Okay, last week we began to discuss the fact that Christ is the creator of all things, as being divine, as being part of the Godhead, as being one of the three persons that is a part of the one being who is God. We shouldn't confuse that, right? Being and person are not synonymous. Humans are one being each and one person each. But when it comes to the Trinity, there's one being of God and three persons who share those same attributes. They do not share them 33 and a third percent each. They each are 100% God, right? And so this week, I'd like to discuss Christ as the preeminent creator. And you may say, well, that sounds rather redundant, but bear with me, because I think that is the point that Paul makes in Colossians chapter 1 that we are going to discuss this time. And we're going to be reading Colossians chapter 1, beginning with verse 15. Now, last week we talked from the point of view of what John, the gospel writer, has to say about Christ, that he is the creator and he is therefore God. And that's how his gospel begins. He says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then he goes on to talk about how all things were created by him. He makes that point clearly in his book. He also spoke about the purpose of his book. Not every book of the New Testament, or the Bible for that matter, tells us explicitly what the purpose of that book is. But in the Gospel of John, in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, John does that very thing. He tells us specifically what the purpose of his gospel is. And the purpose of his gospel was that we may believe that Jesus is the Christ, and that in believing, the Son of God, and that in believing, we may have life in his name. And so this week, now we're shifting gears a little bit, going from one of the original apostles to the one who is the self-described one born as of out of due time, and that is Paul. Obviously, we remember this, the history of Paul. Paul was a Pharisee, a persecutor of the church, who in Hebrews chapter 8 is spoken of as, or the end of chapter 7 rather, is spoken of as one who was giving his consent to those who were stoning Peter, or rather Stephen, the first martyr of the church that is recorded anyway. And so he was an individual who, from the beginning, was a persecutor of the church. And as a matter of fact, Christ encountered him on the road to Damascus, where he was going to do that very thing. He was going to continue the persecution of the church, binding some of the Christians, and perhaps even executing some others eventually. And so Paul was not a friend of the church. There are many apologists that have been built around Paul, because Paul was an enemy of the church. And yet, he became perhaps, after Christ himself, the greatest precursor of the church, the greatest supporter of the mission of the gospel in the world. So Paul tells us that Jesus is the creator, and therefore he is preeminent, because he who creates is preeminent. The writer of Hebrews makes that point when he compares Christ to Moses and talks about how the builder of the house is so much greater than the house itself. And so since Christ created Moses, then Moses is preeminent over, or Christ is preeminent over Moses. Paul also tells us in Colossians that Christ is the image of the invisible God. Let's read that passage now, beginning with Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 and following. And it reads as follows: "And he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church, and he is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself might come to have first place in everything. For it was his Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, were the things on earth or things in heaven. And so we see there that Christ is preeminent. Christ is the creator. Christ is the sustainer of all things. And again, the writer of Hebrews make that same point. I'm sure you know that Tim thinks that Paul wrote Hebrews. And there's a number of things in the first few chapters of Hebrews that sound very Pauline, although they're not said in Pauline style, which is interesting. But the writer of Hebrews in chapter 1 of his letter also makes the point that Christ sustains all things by the word of his power. And so here Paul echoes that sentiment. In John 14:9, Jesus tells Philip, "If you have seen me, you have seen the Father." And in Hebrews 1:3, the writer of Hebrews tells us that Christ is the express image of his person. In other words, Jesus is visibly what the Father looks like in spirit. And so when we see Christ physically, obviously we can only see the physicality of God in Christ, because we are physical beings. We do not have the eyes to be able to see the things of the Spirit as of yet. But when we see Christ, we see what God is like: Father, Son, and Spirit, all three. So what was the purpose of Paul in writing Colossians? And I mention that because a lot of times we make the mistake of forgetting the fact that there is a purpose for which the writer wrote his book, and that purpose will help us understand the book better. The writing of Colossians was precipitated in part to refute an incipient form of proto-Gnosticism and Jewish superstition. Now, Gnosticism was a philosophy which really developed beginning in the 2nd century, but which still had some of its first beginnings. Some of the first folks that were dabbling in Gnosticism began to do so towards the middle and the latter part of the 1st century. John, for example, in his letters, combats Gnosticism. There was an individual who he battled with quite a bit. His name was Cerinthus, and he was a Gnostic. He was one of the first Gnostics. And so Gnosticism was something that, although did not really begin to develop well into the 2nd century, it was seeing its beginnings here in the 1st century. Excuse me. And in the case of the Colossian church, it not only was a Gnostic problem, but it was also mingled with a lot of Jewish superstition and mysticism. And so here you have a tremendous challenge that Paul was addressing when he was talking about those things. If you look at beginning with chapter 2 of the letter of Colossians, you see there issues dealing with worship of angels, with the keeping of Sabbath, not only the Sabbath itself, but also feasts. And it was a syncretistic mix of various religions and cults that had found their way into the Colossian church and had begun to attempt to infiltrate Christianity in that location. Now, think with me back to the 1st century. Remember, there's no iPhone. There's no even phones at all, right? There's no information travels at a snail's pace. If you want to send a letter from, let's say, Jerusalem to Colossae, it's going to take at least several days, perhaps weeks, because it's going to go by land, and it's going to go either somebody walking or riding on horses at best. And so you have a church established in Colossae, for example. You may have Paul in one of the cities of Greece, let's say Corinth. or in Rome at this stage where he wrote this letter from. He is a prisoner in Rome. And so you have that great distance between those two cities. So a lot can happen in the time that a letter from Paul gets to the Colossian church. A lot of those Gnostic beliefs, a lot of those syncretistic beliefs can continue to mature and develop. And by the time that the church in Colossae hears from Paul, there could be a tremendous issue, a tremendous challenge there for the Christians trying to determine what's what. And so...
Mike, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just wondering whoever's connecting with the iPhone might mute themselves. That they keep distracting from your message.
Oh, okay.
Whoever's got the iPhone, can they mute themselves?
Yeah, whoever's got the iPhone, I'm not getting your name on my screen. So if you could mute your microphone, we would appreciate it. So anyway, make sure that you hit your mute, just, everybody, just to make sure. Okay, thank you. So again, the world of the first century is quite different than our own. And so sometimes we have a little difficulty trying to determine how things worked at the time. So anyway, the letter of the Colossians is written. It takes several months to get to the Colossian church. And so again, the problem continues. But Paul writes this letter to a church that he perhaps had met through Philemon, because you remember the letter to Philemon talks about Philemon being part of the church in Colossae and so on and so forth. And so seeks to address those issues in that church there with his letter, which, obviously we don't know. History says nothing as to whether that heresy was arrested or whether it continued to make inroads. Again, we know that it continued into the 2nd century and became much stronger in the 2nd century and in centuries after that. So in our own day, fast forwarding a couple of millennia, in our own day, the battle over Jesus' divinity continues. Whereas in the Colossian church, it was an issue of Gnosticism. In other words, the idea, the primary issue of Gnosticism, there were a number of varieties. There was Valentinian Gnosticism and Cerinthian and so on and so forth. But the primary issue was that the flesh was evil and the spirit was good. And so the battle there was, what John says in his letters. Jesus came in the flesh. And if you do not confess that Jesus has come in the flesh, then you are not of God. Because that was what he was battling, the idea that Jesus could not have come in the flesh because the flesh is evil. And so that was the battle then. The battle in our own day is whether Jesus is God. For example, the Jehovah's Witnesses, I talked about them last week, but they say that Jesus is the first and greatest of all of God's creations. In other words, the only thing that God, the Father, or God in their estimation, the only person that's God, created directly was Jesus. And then through Jesus, he created everything else. Here's my trusty New World Translation again. And in Colossians chapter 1, what we have just read from the New American Standard, this is what verses 15 and 16 of the NWT say. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, because by means of him all other things were created in the heavens and on the earth. I don't know if you notice that subtle word that's inserted in there, all other things. And it is the idea that since he is himself the first created being, well, therefore, all other things were created by him, not all things absolutely. Now, here's the problem with that. The problem with that is that there's no manuscript that includes the word other in it. It is simply an invention that was inserted into the text by the Jehovah's Witnesses because that passage does not agree with their particular theology concerning Christ. And so you begin to see the problem that we in our day face, whereas Paul was facing the Gnostics, we are facing the Christ deniers, and that's what they are. They may say they follow Christ, but they do not follow the real Christ. The way that you can recognize a so-called Christian cult is by seeing what they believe about Jesus. Usually they will believe that he is something less than what he is in reality. And the Jehovah's Witnesses are no different. If you don't have the right Jesus, you don't have the right Father either. Christian cults will often use the same terminology that the Orthodox use. They will talk about faith. They will talk about Christianity and about how you have to repent, for example. You have to have faith and so on and so forth. But what they mean often by those words is something very different than what the Orthodox Church, what the Bible truly teaches. And so we have to be careful when we hear a cultist use the language that we are familiar with, because they will mean something totally different by it than what we mean. Without the Son and without the Father, obviously you cannot be saved. And so whenever we encounter individuals who are of this mindset and who are following this false doctrine, we need to treat them as such, as individuals who are lost and who need to hear the gospel, not as fellow believers who are on their way to heaven as we are. And so there you have it,